So we're seeing massive developments in Syria. After 13 years of civil war, there has been a massive movement of opposition forces sweeping aside the Syrian army and now moving into Damascus, the capital of Syria, displacing perhaps the government of Bashar al-Assad, the dictator of Syria who's been in power since 2000. A momentous development given the fact that the Syrian Civil War has occupied so much attention since it began in 2011. But what exactly is happening on the ground in Syria? What does it mean for Bashar al-Assad's government? Who exactly are these Syrian opposition forces, and what are the stakes of the great powers involved in this conflict, as well as India? Joining us to explain all of these questions is Kabir Taneja of the Observer Research Foundation, one of India's finest watchers of what's happening in West Asia. Kabir, thank you so much for joining us on a Sunday, I might add. Could you tell us a little bit about what's going on the ground in Syria in terms of these massive movements forward that we're seeing of the Syrian opposition forces?
Yeah, so I mean, over the past couple of days, we have seen the Syrian militia rebels, largely led by a group called al-Sham, who's in turn led by a guy called Abu Muhammad al-Jolani, making significant strides in the country's east. So they started off with cities like Aleppo, Idlib, Homs, Hama, all sort of central to opposition to Assad, which started in 2011. But over the past couple of years, the Syrian civil war had been basically in hibernation. In that time, clearly, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham has built a lot of capacity. They've built a lot of structures. They seem to be very well prepared, which has allowed them to sort of take this opportunity right now to challenge the Assad centrality in Damascus. What the really sort of strange thing that has happened is that there was no pushback by the Syrian army. Most of the cities fell very quickly. Over past 48 to 72 hours, I think they took 3 to 4 major cities, including Hama and so on, and Dara and so on, which are like, I think, the second and the fourth largest cities or somewhere there in Syria. There was no sort of pushback from the army. There was no pushback from any population. There was no pushback from any pro-Assad sections of the polity, of the Ba'athist party, and so on and so forth. So everything, the entire house of cards was clearly sort of balanced on very thin ground, and it didn't take a lot by the HTS to push that house of cards down.
Right. Could you also explain a little bit about what we've seen over the last 13 years? If you could, I hate to ask you for a potted history of what's been happening over the last 13 years in Syria, but could you explain a little bit about Bashar al-Assad, his family? He's, of course, controlled Syria since 2000. In many ways, on the international stage, a pariah, even for the Arab world until very recently. Could you explain a little bit about this man, why he attracts so much controversy and attention across the world?
Yeah, so I mean, Bashar al-Assad comes from the illustrious, so to speak, Assad family. The Socialist Ba'athist Party, which the Assad family runs, came into power in the 1960s through a coup. And since then, his father was the sort of the first Syrian leader after the coup, and since then, Bashar al-Assad has been in charge. And over the years, of course, they have the Assad family has marketed itself as a very secularist, very moderate leadership in Syria. The challenge really for them started to happen in 2011 when the larger Arab Spring was taking place. That was seen as an opportunity in Syria by the opposition, by the rebels, to sort of get together and try to mount a challenge to the Assad movement. We have to also remember that the Assad family comes from an Alawite background, which is a minority sect in Syria. So that already complicated the power structures within the Syrian polity for a long period of time, for decades actually. So a lot of the tensions that came out in 2011 were basically opportunistic. They already pre-existed for a long period of time, despite their sort of, as I said, marketed agency of being a very secularist and moderate political entity. They were known for having a very strong hand when it came to sort of delivering their brand of justice to their own people. There are n number of documented cases of disappearances and heavy-handed punishments being given to the Syrian people, and specifically when it comes to, let's say, their own secret police was known to be a very notorious agency. There are some prisons that were liberated by the rebels, in their own words, over the past 24 to 40 hours, and a lot of people that came out of those prisons have been imprisoned by the Assad government since the 80s and since the 90s.
Right.
Without really any great charges. So it's basically a domino effect to what started in 2011 under the Assad regime. There was a outright challenge mounted, and that was not just Syria at that point of time. We saw that in Egypt. It started in Tunisia. It was an entire movement. But when the challenge really came to Damascus during that time, the Russians and the Iranians took a decision that it is in their interest also that the Assad government stays in power. So they gave a lot of support, both political and military, to make sure that the Assad government is stable enough that it maintains some sort of power in Damascus.
Right. And what we've seen really is this extraordinary development in the Syrian Civil War over the last 14 years. You had things like the rise of ISIS, the defeat of ISIS then, after pressure was put, of course, by Russia as well as the United States military. There was this feeling just a couple of years ago that the Syrian government had effectively pushed back opposition forces, taken control of large parts of the territory of Syria, as well as just last year finding some acceptability again in terms of its pariah diplomatic status by getting back into the Arab League. So Kabir, could you just explain to us, what we were seeing in terms of people saying that, look, the Syrian regime seems to be on much firmer footing, and now we just see that just in a matter of weeks, this entire edifice has fallen apart. Could you just explain what exactly happened that made people think that, okay, the Assad regime is stable and has managed to win this war, as it were, but now what we're seeing in these 2 weeks is just the falling apart of the entire regime? Could you just explain that stark shift?
Yeah, so I mean, look, it's really difficult to ascertain sort of what the internal dynamics within the Assad immediate group of power was. But clearly, one can, I guess, substantiate from what has taken place over the past couple of days that there were a lot of there was a lot of hollowness within the Assad government, within their own power structures, considering no one has really stepped up to try and prop up or even take charge after Assad has left. There is no one from his regime, no one from his government, no one from his family that has stepped up and said, oh, okay, Assad has left the country. Let us try to sort of get some semblance of structure, political power, of economic stability into place, so that we disallow someone like al-Jolani, who's from the HTS group, who's coming from a very Islamist radical background. Jolani was affiliated with both Al-Qaeda and Islamic State at some point of time in his past. So the fact that none of those procedures have moved shows that the government from inside was completely hollowed out. It's just that the facade they presented to everyone was a level of or a semblance of normalcy that's being sort of maintained in Damascus, but clearly that was not the case. When it comes to sort of some of the sort of broader connotations to what happens or why he was, let's say, being normalized by the Arabs and so on and so forth, you have to remember in 2011, 2012, when this problem started, the Arab states, including the UAE, Saudi, and so on and so forth, did not support the Assad regime. Some of them even funded the rebels to sort of be seen at least siding with the Syrian people rather than the Assad ecosystem. So and then later on, of course, there was a larger regional implications that were playing out. For the Arabs normalizing Assad in the Arab League and so on and so forth, and other such institutions were basically an opportunity to try and wean him off the influence of Iran. They did not want Syria to be this conduit to Iranian influence for a long period of time. And when they saw an opportunity to try and do that, they did try and do that, right? Normalizing Assad was part of that plan. And even I think Assad also wanted, at some level, not to be a client state to the Russians and the Iranians, that he wanted a level of autonomy to be returned to the Assad family and to the Socialist Baathist Party, because till basically a month ago, he was predominantly subservient to both Iran and Russia at some level.
Right. Could you tell us a little bit about you touched upon it briefly about the HTS, about the opposition forces coming in, moving into Damascus, declaring it free of Assad's control. Who are these opposition forces? What exactly is the HTS? If Assad's regime falls, Who exactly is most likely to benefit in terms of these opposition forces? Who are they really?
So, the HTS is the one that is the most visible and vocal right now. Over the past 2, 3 years, as I said, this organization is run by Abu Muhammad al-Jolani, who's a militia leader. For a long period of time over the past 3 years, they did control a significant chunk of territory in Syria's north and northeast regions. So in those parts for the past 3 years, they had set up basically a quasi state within a state. Where HTS was basically the government. They were running the hospitals. They had installed their own taxation systems. They had installed their own laws and edits and so on and so forth. So they were basically running their own state within a state for a long period of time. So what has happened now is that when they saw this opportunity to mobilize militarily, and just very quickly segueing into the military part, we have to remember that over the past 3 years, the HTS also built a very official format of its military, right? So they're very well trained. There are military academies that HTS runs. In 2011, 2012, when they started, a lot of Syrian regime army generals and commanders actually defected to HTS because they were against the Assad regime. For various reasons, for political reasons and sectarian and ethnic reasons. So they had this know-how of how to build a good military infrastructure, which they clearly have done over the past 2, 3 years, which is what mobilized. On that front, they basically took the best opportunity available to them and mounted this. But if you see a lot of al-Jolani's statements being made since 2020, 2021, he's been alluding to this happening at some point of time. It's just, I think they were felt very prepared right now and felt that politically Assad is weak enough that this can be done. Now, very quickly, HTS is only one of the opposition rebels here. There are others such as the Syrian Democratic Forces, which is largely manned by Kurdish militias, but it has a spattering of other sort of ethnic groups as well. And SDF has been supported by the West over the past many years because they fought Islamic State on the ground, and they are sort of this again very quasi broad secularist inclusive militia that has taken along a lot of ethnic groups below their umbrella. But the SDF has only sort of influenced some regions in this juggernaut that we have witnessed over the past 3, 4 years. It is HTS that has taken most of the claim. But there are now the possibilities of these militias fighting amongst themselves in the future is also there. That means that political stability is still a very unknown factor, even if someone like al-Jolani really stakes claim, a political claim in Damascus going forward. For a long period of time, these groups were sort of palatable because they fought the Islamic State. So a lot of the ground offensives against Islamic State in following 2014, 2015 up until 2019 were conducted by a lot of these groups. A lot of the assassinations of Islamic State top leaders were done by intelligence agencies of the SDF, for example. Like they gathered all the information before airstrikes were done by the US and allies. So it's a very complicated web of what has taken place over the past 3, 4 years. But at this point of time where we are standing, HTS seems to be the organization that probably is going to stake claim on Damascus. And that is a worrying thing because of their sort of past with both Al-Qaeda and Islamic State itself.
Right. Could I ask you a little bit about India and how India will be looking at what's happening in Syria right now? India's had a bit of an interesting position on the conflict in the early years, of course. It actually voted against sanctions on Syria when much of the Western world was pushing for sanctions on Bashar al-Assad's government. It has broadly appreciated Syria's support on issues like Kashmir. It has provided humanitarian aid. Could you explain a little bit about how India has built a relationship with the Assad government over the last decade or so? Could you talk maybe a little bit also about how India will look at what seems like his imminent fall from power?
Well, India's position, as you said, that has been fairly consistent over the past couple of years, especially since this problem started in 2011. If you go back to 2014, 2013, when the Russians intervened in Syria at the invitation of Bashar al-Assad, so it wasn't unilateral. Bashar al-Assad invited Russia to come in. because Russians have a base in the Tartus region of Syria. It's India's position at that time was that, okay, look, the Russian intervention is basically to take on the Islamic State, and we don't really see much of a problem with that. Over that period of time, of course, India has had sort of cordial relationship with the Assad government, going back to his father when he started off in the 60s and the 70s, going up till Bashar al-Assad's over the past 30 years, largely because there was a semblance of stability to deal with as far as India's own interests are concerned. At some point of time, India even invested in oil and gas in Syria, which the fields in the country's Deir ez-Zor region, which were lost in 2013 when the rebel offensives became very heightened. But despite all that, despite the attacks on Damascus itself in 2014-15, India largely maintained its embassy in Damascus. Only for a brief period of time, due to security reasons, in 2015, did India vacate its ambassador from there? But charge d'affaires still remained in the embassy. So India actually never closed its diplomatic mission despite the challenges in Syria. During that time, during the challenge to Assad, India hosted a whole bunch of Assad loyalists in Delhi, including people like Botiana Shaban, who was a close advisor. She came here many times and gave talks and tried to sort of put the Syrian position forward. The core thing is, it's not about being very close to the Assads or very close to any political center in Damascus. Whoever comes, India is going to deal with it, as we have seen in Afghanistan, for example. But India's concern has always been to something that they've raised with Libya, for example, that there is no plan B here, that we don't know who's going to come in next. There is a power vacuum. We have no idea who's going to fill. And it's always a bit wise that if there is a revolutionary sort of movement to displace and dislodge a political government system, that there should be, let's say, a more cohesive and coherent opposition ready to take place, which is not the case in Syria. HTS is not a very coherent organization. It's an Islamist organization, and India has been saying this since the Libyan crisis. When Gaddafi was dislodged in somewhat similar manners, not the same manners, but we see what kind of situation Libya is in. So if from Indian point of view, that level of stability, if it can be maintained from a very realist position, is what they always have propagated for. But of course, whatever the reality is, India will have to adapt to whatever the political future of Damascus is going to be.
And if I could ask you one or two final questions in terms of the stakes of the other great powers. Of course, you were talking about Russia, you were talking about Iran, you were talking about the United States. We've had this tweet from Donald Trump saying that we should stay out of what's happening in Syria. Could I ask you for again a sort of a potted summary of what the major powers are going to be thinking about what's happening right now in Syria with the United States? The United States has covertly and sometimes not so covertly has troops in Syria as well. What is the United States going to be thinking about the fall of Assad? Which players would it want to particularly back? What is Russia going to be thinking? Is this, of course, a lot of people on social media suggesting, of course, that this is a symbol of the distraction of the Russian state because of what is happening in Ukraine. It has much bigger problems. How is China going to look at this? How is Iran going to look at this? Could I ask for a potted summary of what the major powers are going to be thinking as Assad's government teeters, if not falls entirely?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's a double-edged sword for everyone. It's going to be very, very dicey and tricky for even the closest allies of the Assad thing, and even the wildest detractors of the Assad regime. And I'll tell you why. Because Jolani, if he does take claim on Damascus, he's very vocally said that he is not very happy with the Iranian and Russian presence in the region. That means that that he's going to sort of challenge the status quo of how Syria has been intervened in over the past couple of years. And he said that in multiple statements since the last couple of years. But while that is, well, could be seen as music to the ears of, let's say, the Arab powers and Israel specifically. Sort of, if considering Syria was used as a staging ground for Iranian militias to transport weapons and other such paraphernalia into Lebanon to arm Hezbollah, for example. So if all that can end in some shape or form, then it works for Israel and the Arab world. But for them, the larger problem is that the Al-Jolani is from an Islamist background. For a long period of time, the Arab powers have thumbed down organizations such as the Muslim Brotherhood. So if you have done that as a policy over the past 5-6 years, you cannot be palatable to an organization that has its groundings in Al Qaeda and Islamic State. Now there is, of course, Jolani keeps on saying himself that I dissociated with both those two groups a long period of time. But he's also, for example, said in a CNN interview, I think day before yesterday or yesterday, that an Islamic structured government is going to take place in Damascus. Now he's not expanded on what that means. But if you see sort of the way he's governed HTS led geographies within Syria, it's not going to be very palatable to the Arab powers and Israel alike. So even though he's saying that he's going to push back against Iran and Russia, long term, I don't think he's going to be in a very good position to deal with either the Arab powers or Israel at the same time. We're already seeing sort of a challenge of Islamist groups in the Golan Heights, where Israel is also present, right? So we are seeing that those challenges come into fray, despite the fact that a lot of these countries at some level would be happy that Assad is gone. The challenges are not stopping. They're only going to continue going forward, especially when we talk about regional interests of both Iran and the Arab powers and Israel alike.
Right. And if I could ask you one final question in terms of, lots of people are talking about this question, and I know that we're asking you to engage in a little crystal ball gazing, but, lots of questions now about how, look, Assad's fall from power may be a positive development given his past record, but given divisions within the rebel forces themselves, as well as the differing interests of the great powers as well, could there be this possibility of things getting even worse than they are in terms of a prolonged conflict? What are your views on this? Does it seem like there is some level of cohesion among opposition forces for some sort of unity government?
I don't see that happening, and that's the biggest problem. There is no plan B, as I said earlier. There doesn't seem to be a blueprint. We have seen some voices of Syrian opposition celebrating Syrian opposition, political opposition. So not necessarily HTS or SDF or any of these groups, but other opposition leaders who are in other countries celebrating. But I would be very surprised if if Jolani sort of decides that yes, we will cut a deal with them and they can come here and try to set up a government. The fact that he's pushed so hard militarily for such a long period of time, that he built this governance system which he's already started implementing in cities that HTS has taken over. So there are HTS led hospitals running, there are HTS led sanitation workers that have moved in, there are HTS led police officers and traffic police that are managing cities. That's already started happening. So I don't see any space that Jolani and company are going to give to any political opposition that are either outside India, outside Syria or outside the Middle East, that may want to come in and do this. Last time that happened in 1979, the same euphoria you saw with people in Iran, for example, in 1979, the Shah, the Iranian Shah was thrown out. There was public euphoria everywhere, like we are seeing in Syria right now. And then the Ayatollah came in, and it was we know the situation that Iran is in right now. So from that aspect, I think it's too early to say, but it's a very sort of delicate position. I don't think there's a whole lot to celebrate right now from an analyst point of view. The Syrians are celebrating because they see a very oppressive regime has been removed. They have suffered under it clearly by a lot of accounts that have been published in the past 2-3 days. So for a brief moment, I think there will be this semblance of happiness within the Syrians that that the Assad regime is gone. But what comes next is anyone's guess right now. It could also be theoretically worse than what the Assad regime presented over the past 30-40 years.
Understood. Kabir Taneja of the Observer Research Foundation explaining to us what's happening right now on the ground in Syria, what the interests of the various great powers are, including India's interest in what the conflict in Syria, who the opposition forces are, and what this means for the future of Syria. Kabir, thank you so much for your time and for explaining this to us, again, as I might mention, on a Sunday. And thank you so much also to our viewers for catching this story. We will keep you absolutely updated with coverage from the ground, as well as analysis from India's best experts, as well as the best experts that we have on Syria, on the region. Thank you so much for watching us here on India Today Global.